Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. We speak in English tonight. Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue tout le monde. Je serai Louis, votre hôte pour ce soir, pour cette conférence un petit peu inédite et hors du cadre de notre cycle de conférences avec Rob Hopkins. Le célèbre, l'unique. Il est 18h01. Voilà. J'espère que vous allez bien. Nous, on est très contents de le recevoir ce soir. On espère que vous allez bien chez vous, que vous avez hâte et que tout se passe bien, que vous avez plein de questions à lui poser. Comment va se dérouler ce soir? On va bientôt inviter Rob et il fera sa présentation donc sur les villes en transition et son petit motto Act Local, Think Global. Et puis alors, ça durera 3 quarts d'heure et ensuite on passera une séance de questions-réponses voilà, et puis après ce sera la fin. Donc évidemment, je ne nous ai pas présenté, mais nous sommes le Plaskot, côte à projet étudiant. Et donc ici, donc en plus de faire des machines, de construire des machines, si vous voulez, on pourrait vous les montrer sur notre Insta. Elles sont en ligne. En plus de ça, du coup, on fait du recyclage de plastique. On est 5 étudiants de Elmo. Oui, je disais, je suis très content de vous accueillir ce soir tous. Et en plus de faire des machines qui recyclent le plastique, on fait des cycles de conférences pendant le confinement, parce qu'on a que ça à faire. Et on fait aussi du zéro déchet, des astuces un petit peu. Vous pouvez retrouver toute notre actualité sur Instagram ou sur notre page Facebook, Préjuste Plaskot. Voilà. Il est 18h03. J'espère que vous êtes là, que vous êtes connectés. Ce soir, donc, on reçoit Rob Hopkins, un militant et environnementaliste anglais. Donc, évidemment, oui, la conférence va être en anglais. Donc, là, je vous fais plaisir, on parle en français, mais on va bientôt switch à l'anglais. Rob Hopkins, donc, environnementaliste anglais, écrivain, aussi professeur de permaculture en Angleterre. Ouais, voilà. Hi Rob, how are you doing?
Hello, bonsoir à tous.
You're doing great tonight.
Plaisir.
Nice. Your French is excellent. Thank you for coming and accepting our proposition to such a speaking event. I know that your schedule was a bit busy, so it's a real pleasure. It's funny because when I contact you, we should have seen you a year ago with Helmo in Belgium for a conference here in Belgium. But it was the crisis, so we didn't have the chance. And I personally was really looking forward to it. So it's a real pleasure to have you tonight. I presented you, and I think that we are okay to go if there is no counter order. So I give you the hand to the presentation. Make us dream, make us use our imagination, and the place is yours. Thank you.
Merci. Bonsoir à tous. Je suis désolé que je ne parle pas très bien le français, so I have to speak in English. My apologies. So, yes, hopefully you can see my pictures. I want to share some pictures with you. Is that all good? Because I can't see anybody. So I'm hoping that you can see these. So I want to talk to you about imagination, about climate change, and about why we need both of those things together. Well, we don't need climate change. Why we need climate change so that we can address, why we need imagination so that we can address climate change. You know what I mean. Anyway, so I wanted to just start by telling a story, I guess. So I feel like in 2021, like humanity has climbed a mountain, and we are standing on top of this mountain. Beneath our feet is more plastic, more carbon, more debt, more anxiety than we have ever stood on top of before. And the guides who are at our side, the Sherpas who know this mountain really well, they can see the very dark clouds that are coming very quickly towards us. And they are saying, we need to climb down off this mountain really, really quickly. And for some people, that's okay. That's we understand. They are the experts. They know the mountain better than we do. Yeah, let's go down off this mountain. But for a lot of people, that doesn't seem to be working. They say, oh, I don't agree with you, and maybe the clouds aren't so bad, and I like it up here. It's very beautiful up here. And I think that maybe a more skillful thing to do might be to tell the stories of the valleys that are waiting for us when we climb down the mountain. If we can tell the stories of the delicious wine and the beautiful food and the really comfortable warm beds and the dry socks that are waiting for us when we climb down from this mountain, if we can create a desire, a longing for that place, then we come down off the mountain very quickly. And I wonder with climate change whether if instead of trying to convince everybody that our arguments are the right arguments, if instead we could tell stories about a low carbon future that are so delicious and so exquisite that we can create that longing in the people for that future. And then that becomes the work of storytelling and the work of imagination. So that's what I want to talk to you about tonight, is this question of how could we cultivate, nurture a spirit of longing in people for a low carbon world. And the human imagination is central to that. And the human imagination is a really extraordinary thing. My favorite definition of imagination is that it is our ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Our ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. So our ability to look at something, but to see the possibilities that are there. And I think that at this time in history, cultivating and nurturing the human imagination is one of the most important things that we can do. And this is Walida Imarisha, who's an incredible writer and activist in America. She said, whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction. I love that so much. All organizing is science fiction, because all activism, all campaigning is fundamentally about getting people to imagine what's in front of them in a different way, to look at the world and to see its possibilities rather than just seeing what currently exists. And one of the beautiful things about the human imagination is that it is at its strongest when it has some limits around it. So if I were to say, Cecile, tell me a story, that's kind of difficult. Where would you start? If I said, tell me a story about the mouse with a blue hat who lives underneath the piano in your house, then I have put some limits, and then you can start to tell a story. So Dr. Seuss wrote this book, which I'm sure you all know from your own childhood. And he wrote this book because his publisher challenged him to write a book that just used 50 words. That was all he had, 50 words. And he said later that it was the best exercise his imagination ever had. So the beautiful thing that I see, whether I visit Belgium or France or Sweden or Spain, is that the communities who are recognizing the limits that the climate change crisis imposes, and who absorb those limits and understand those limits and then engage their imagination, are the places coming up with all of the best solutions, not the people like the Donald Trumps of this world who like to imagine that there is no crisis and that it's all imaginary. The problem that we have is that our collective imagination, which should be a muscle like this, is currently a muscle like this, because we have created over the last 20 years the worst possible conditions for the human imagination. There was research published in 2010 which showed that imagination and IQ rose together until the mid-1990s. And in the mid-1990s, then IQ continued to rise and imagination started to decline and has been declining ever since. And when this research was published, it made the front page of Newsweek magazine. People said, "Oh, what does this mean for economic growth? And oh, what does this mean for Hollywood and Pixar?" I never heard anybody in the climate change, social justice, economic justice world say, "What does this mean for us?" Because fundamentally, we have to be able to reimagine everything: food, transport, housing, energy, if we are to survive the next 20, 30, 40 years. Naomi Klein says, there are no non-radical solutions left. And as Mariame Kaba, one of my great heroes, said, she wrote, "We live in a system that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability. We feel like the possibilities of a different future are being closed down rather than opening, and that's a real problem." So how might we start to expand the longing of Liège, of Belgium, of the world for a different kind of a future? I think one way is with art. This is an amazing artist based at the University of Leeds who draws the future. So he looked in his city and said, what might it be like in this city in 10 years if it had become the most biodiverse city in the world? Well, maybe it would look like this. And when you have a picture like this, maybe it makes it more easy to smell that future, to hear that future, to almost touch that future. Art like this can be really powerful. This is another of his drawings where he says, when we close the streets to cars, which is happening in more and more places, what do we do with the space? There's so much space we give to cars. When we take that space back, what could we do? Maybe we could turn it into gardens like this. And our children walk to school through gardens like this. If we could cultivate the longing for this, we could do this in a really short period of time. Making this happen is not the problem. Creating the longing for this is what matters. And that, again, is the work of imagination. That is the work of storytelling. So all too often, you walk down streets in the city where you live, maybe streets that look like this. This is in London. And you think, well, it looks like this, and it will always look like this. And it's very hard to have our kind of possibilities glasses that mean we can look at the world and see the possibilities. But this is something really cool created by some people who made an animation to show, actually, maybe this street could be like this. And when you can see it like that, then our sense of what's possible when we're in that space is changed. Our imagination is able to engage with that place in a very different way. And you might be thinking, well, Rob, this all sounds very nice, but in the real world, this kind of thing never happens. I think you're very naive, Rob, and this is a bit silly. Well, this is actually already happening in some places. This is in Barcelona, where the municipality in Barcelona announced recently they are going to close 30% of the streets in the center of Barcelona and turn them into forests and places for people to play and for communities to meet each other, places with no cars. And this is the future of our cities. This is not some crazy idea. This is now where our cities need to go. We know that air pollution made people much more vulnerable to COVID, and we need to be creating more and more spaces in our cities where the air is as clean as it can be. I now wanted to just share with you two very quick little videos. I run a podcast, and in that podcast, I ask my guests to imagine that they travel to 2030. And it's a 2030 that is not utopia, but it is the result of us doing everything that we could possibly do. And then I say, describe that world to us. And so I cut together some clips of my favorite things they said, and I worked with two animators, and they're about a minute long each. And so Cécile is now going to show you those two films.
Okay, I'm going to share the second video.
Okay, thank you.
Share, sorry, hop. And okay, I'm going to share the second video. Okay, thank you. Share, sorry, hop.
Louis, si tu coupes ton son, on n'entend pas le son à l'écran.
All right, we can go back to the. Sorry, it was my bad for this. I think that they didn't have sound on the second video. I'm sorry, it's my bad. Won't happen again. And Rob, you don't have sounds too. Maybe it was you but we can go back to the presentation, and I will share the videos.
Okay, don't worry. We can give you a link. Sorry that didn't work, everybody. We will give you a link. They're very beautiful anyway. I hope you enjoyed them. But they make more sense with the sound. So I will give you a link at the end where you can watch.
Thank you.
So what I would like to share with you today is something that we call the Imagination Sundial, which grew out of some work that I was involved with somebody called Rob Shorter, which was about thinking, okay, we are living in a time of a climate and ecological emergency, which demands that we reimagine everything. So where do we start? If the world, the imaginative capacity of the world is shrinking, how do we rebuild it? And there are 4 things, and what I want to do is to share those with you and to tell you some stories. So, and I can give you a link to this afterwards, so you don't have to read all the tiny writing if you like. So, space. The first one is space. You all know in your own lives that the time you are at your most imaginative is when you have space. So when if you are really stressed and really anxious and really busy, it's very hard to live a really imaginative life. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he rode his bicycle in the forest. But that space is disappearing out of our lives. The chief executive of Netflix recently said that their main competition wasn't Amazon, wasn't Apple, was sleep. And we are finding that space where we would normally daydream and look out of the window and write, we now just fill with Facebook and with very addictive screens. But space is absolutely vital for the imagination. If we don't give it space, then it has nowhere to breathe. And I think we need to be looking at things like a universal income, at a 4-day working week as being national imagination strategies, because people need space for an imaginative life. The second one is place. What I mean by place, and I'm sure you will all have had places like this in your life, a place that you visit that really changes your sense of what's possible. And afterwards, when you go home, you look at that place in a very different way. You see its possibilities in different ways. So this is in London in April 2019, when Extinction Rebellion closed this bridge for 2 weeks. This is Waterloo Bridge in the middle of London. They closed the bridge for 2 weeks. Normally this bridge is very heavy traffic, many cars, the air smells terrible. For 2 weeks, they turned that bridge into a forest. They put trees all down the middle, and many people who work around there would stop and say, this is so nice. Why can't it always be like this? And I heard many stories like this because my wife was there for the whole 2 weeks. She was arrested 3 times. I'm very, very proud of her. And these kind of places are really important, where they change our sense of what might be possible. This is in Houston, in Texas, where a man called Jason Roberts started an organization called Better Block. And what Better Block do is they go to a place like this, which nobody loves this place. Nobody really cares about this place. And they speak to the people who live around and work around, and they say, what does this place need? What do you love? What do you long for? And then they go back to their fab lab and they make things. And then one day they arrive just when it's starting to get dark, and they work through the night. And the next day they have turned this place into this place. They fill that space with community and conversation and conviviality and connection. I like to think of it as being like a pop-up tomorrow. So there is the future that you imagine when you long for a low-carbon future. How might you bring it alive now in Liège in 2021 so people can see it and feel it and meet it in that way? It doesn't always have to be so big and ambitious. In San Francisco, about 20 years ago, some artists began to meet each other and to say, where can we find exhibition space that we can afford? Very difficult to find in San Francisco. Somebody said, well, so there's somebody, could somebody mute their microphone there maybe? There's some noise coming through. Then somebody said, well, if you buy a ticket for a car parking space, surely you can do anything in that space. You could put a car in it, or you could put your bed in it and go to sleep, or you could do anything you want in there as long as you have a ticket for that space. So they started an event called Parking Day, where they would buy tickets for car parking spaces and turn them into gardens, art projects, little libraries, little cafes. And again, it's this idea of a place you see every day, but transformed into something else, is a really powerful thing, I think. And also,
Rob, excuse me, Rob, can you share back your screen for us to see the cafes in the small?
Can you not see my pictures?
No, they went away when we switched screen. I'm sorry. It's yes, it's my bad.
So what can you see now? Can you see?
We see us, but normally if you share back your screen, Cecile can put it back on live.
Okay, right. Sorry about this, everybody.
Oh no, I should have told you.
How's that? Is that okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
I can go back. So this is what it looks like with the car parking spaces. So you can, yeah, it's called Parking Day. And it happens, I think, all around the world now. Maybe even in Liège, I don't know. So this is, I feel as well like the architecture that we have in most of our cities in 2021 is really quite deeply damaging to the human imagination. Steel and glass and very boring buildings. This is the work of Hundertwasser, an incredible Austrian architect who said that architects have forgotten how to make beautiful buildings that feed our imagination. So we should let artists design the buildings, and then the architect's job is to figure out how to actually build them. But we should have artists designing our spaces. This is the very famous Hundertwasser house in Vienna, which has a forest on the roof and is beautiful colors. And I wonder how much healthier our collective imagination would be if we were to live in cities with more buildings like this. And sometimes a place can be a huge, a specific town or a city can be one of these places. This is a town in France, in the Alsace, called Ungersheim. And Ungersheim is a really fascinating example of transition in action. So they have started many, many transition projects. They have the biggest solar farm in the whole region. They grow most of the food for all the schools with an organic garden. They have a straw bale co-housing project. They have a local currency called the radish. They do many, many, many things. And there is a film about Ungersheim called Qu'est-ce qu'on attend, which has been shown all over France and Belgium, I imagine. Maybe some of you will have seen it, which is a year in the life in Ungersheim. And that film has really impacted a lot of people and a lot of places who have seen it and said, we want to do that. So when you create a place that has a powerful story to tell, that story can spread to many, many different places. So creating a place that can tell a story is really powerful. So I've talked about space, I've talked about place. The third one is practices. What I mean by practices is things that we can do together which help to exercise and expand our imagination. The first thing to recognize is that imagination is not evenly distributed throughout society. In some ways, imagination is a function of privilege. If our basic needs for shelter and food and work are not met, it's very hard to live an imaginative life. If we suffer from systemic racism, if we suffer from economic exclusion, it's very hard to live an imaginative life. This is a part of your brain called the hippocampus, and it's really important because this is where your memory and your imagination both come from. The thing about the hippocampus that's really interesting is that when we are anxious or stressed or traumatized, our imagination can shrink by about 20%. And when that happens, we become unable to think about the future in hopeful ways. And we just get stuck in the present or stuck in the past. So I wanted to try and find a place that was working to expand the hippocampus. Is it possible? How would you do that? So I went to Dundee in Scotland to an amazing project called Art Angel. And Art Angel works with people with mental health problems, with depression and anxiety. And it says, when you come here, you are an artist. You're not a patient. You're not a client. You're an artist. And you are preparing work for an exhibition. And that's really, really important. And I spoke to so many people there who told me their stories about how before they couldn't see the future and now they could see the future again. It was really, really moving. And every year at Art Angel, to assess how well they're doing, they ask their artists to fill out a piece of paper with 2 shapes of a human body. They say, show the first one, use the first one to show how you felt before you came here. The second to show how you feel now you have been coming here for some time. And I looked through a lot of these. It was very, very moving. I just want to share one with you. So when I look at this picture, firstly, I see how important and skillful the work they do at Art Angel is. Secondly, when I look at this picture, I see what it feels like for human beings to have their hippocampus made larger again. You know, this is having a fully sized hippocampus is what it is to be healthy. And thirdly, when I look at this, I think this is what the next 10 or 15 years will feel like if we are to be successful with the climate emergency. The scientists tell us we need to cut our carbon by to almost zero in the next 10 or 15 years. That's huge. If we were to do that, it will have felt like living through a revolution of the imagination. What does it feel like to live through a revolution of the imagination? I have no idea because I've never seen one, but this is what I imagine. And this is the image that makes me get out of bed every morning to try and do the work that I do. Another practice is something called Transition Town Anywhere. You need a big space. You need between 100 and 400 people. You imagine that you're stepping into 2030 that is the result of us doing everything we could. It's not utopia or paradise, but it's pretty extraordinary. And then you decide, what am I doing in that future? You meet other people who share your interest, and then you build that world with cardboard and string and sticks. And then you live in it and you trade in it. It's an amazing thing to be part of. The poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. So beautiful. These 2 young men here have made the public transport system for our imaginary town, which to you might look like some chairs and some cardboard. To them, this was a completely realized, imagined thing. They could tell you what noise it made, what color the tickets were, what it was made out of, where it went. When we bring play into our activism, it is so much more powerful and potent. One of the things that we need to become really good at is the ability to ask really good what-if questions. And so I want to just tell you a couple of examples of some of my favorite what-if questions. This is Hilary and Dan. They live in London, and they could see the rise of debt created by austerity from the government in London. She is a printmaker, incredible artist. He is a filmmaker. So when the last bank on their street closed, they took over that bank and they turned it into a place where they, as you can see behind them, where they were printing notes. In the evening, the place was where they would have talks and films and community education about economics. And they were printing notes. They were printing these. These are not a local currency. These are like limited edition, very collectible artworks in different denominations. The aim was to sell £50,000 worth of these notes, which they did. And the people on these notes are not the Queen. The people on these notes are the people in that community who are catching the people who are falling because of austerity, because of government policy. So Gary here, for example, he mortgaged his house to raise the money to turn his garage into a food bank. He could see the food need was so bad in his community. Saira and her family, they feed 200 people 2 meals a day at their expense because they can see the need. These are the heroes in our community. So half of the money they raised was shared between these 4 amazing organizations. The other £25,000, they then went to the market where debt is bought and sold, which is a world that many of us know very little about. So if I had a debt of £100 and I didn't pay that debt, after maybe 6 months, that company would sell that debt to another company for maybe just £2. And now I would owe them £200. And then if I still didn't pay it, they might sell it to another company for 50p. But I would still owe them £100. And so there is this world of debt. And so they bought with their £25,000, £1.2 million worth of local debt. And they cancelled the debt. And they wrote to all the people and said, you know, that debt you had, you don't have it anymore. Good luck. Have a good life. We don't want anything in return. But if you would like to join us next week in one place, please do. And when people came, there was this van painted gold, full of pieces of paper with the word debt written on it. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, they blew the van up in a big explosion. And then they collected up all the debris from the explosion. This is my commemorative piece of the glass. This is some of the metal from the van. They melted the metal and made special coins to commemorate this. It was an extraordinary thing. They could have just started a petition online. And there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, they brought their imagination and a good what-if question, which was, what if a community responded to its debt crisis with playfulness and creativity? And all of this was the result of them asking that question. And another of my favorite what-if questions comes from Liège, which is the Ceinture Alimentaire project, which started with a what-if question. Back in 2012, 2013, they said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Which is such a brilliant question because it gives you a taste of a different future. It gives you a sense of what might be possible. So I went there when they launched it, and then I went back a few years later, and that they've now started 25 new cooperatives in Liège and raised 5 million euros from local people, not from the bank. So if you live in Liège, I hope you all really actively support Ceinture Alimentaire and the Petit Producteur shops. My French pronunciation, I'm sure, is not very good. But the Petit Producteur shops, these really are the future. And when I met the mayor of Liège, he said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the future of our city. But again, this project emerged because ordinary people came up with a great what-if question. And I've loved to see during COVID how many communities have used what if as the framing for their thinking about where do they go next. So this is a transition group in England who every day for a month posted a different what if question. So they would ask maybe, what if bird song drowned out the sound of the traffic? The bird song was so loud you couldn't hear the cars. What if car parks became play parks? You know, these were just beautiful questions that people were proposing, and they would make one every day. What if there was a daily imagination lesson? I really liked. And the last one they posted was this, which was, they didn't need even to put the whole words what if. But this image speaks to me about contentment and happiness and community and connection. This one of the things that capitalism is so successful at is selling us things which feed our short-term pleasure, which give us dopamine. This speaks more to things that give us contentment and happiness in the longer term. In Sweden, the Green Party take pictures of things that already exist in Sweden, and they put the words what if over the top. And I love this one. What if fathers with young children could take their kids to the woods for the day to play without feeling guilty about all the email they're missing, without feeling guilty that they're not being busy enough? What if our landscapes in our cities were so much more productive, and we used that as a way to involve everybody in the production of food? And in London, in Camden, which was the first council, the first municipality in the UK to declare a climate emergency, they were the first one to do a citizens' assembly in the UK. They, together with the local transition group and local Extinction Rebellion group, took over an empty shop on that high street and turned it into a place they called Think and Do, which was a community imagining space. They invited all different groups, children, women, refugees, different people from all the parts of the society, and invited them to dream about what they would like that place to be like. What's the Camden that you long for? And one of the things that came from that was many, many stories that people wrote from the future. And then they made a new front and back newspaper for their local newspaper with these stories, that it was a newspaper from 2030, bringing the stories from a 2030. This, again, as I say, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. Things like this are so powerful for that, I think. So the last one I want to share with you, the last of the 4 parts of the sundial, and then we'll have some discussion and some questions, is pacts, which is a strange word to use when we talk about imagination, maybe. But this is in Bologna. And in Bologna in Italy, the mayor of Bologna could see that the amount of engagement with local democracy was really starting to decline. And so they started something that was called a civic imagination office. So beautiful. Not a civic participation office, a civic engagement office. It was a civic imagination office to design a place to nurture and support the imagination of Bologna. They created 6 laboratories in different places around the city. They would run events like this, big kind of open space events where people could bring their questions, their dreams, their desires. The brilliant part is that when people would come up with a really good what if question, the municipality would sit with them and say, that's a great idea. Let's make that happen. Okay, we can offer this and this and this and this. You can offer that? Good. Let's make a pact. And in Bologna, in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts, from small things to really, really big, ambitious things. And now the Civic Imagination Office is how they do participatory budgeting, how they decide uses for buildings they don't need anymore. What I love about it is that for many of you, I'm sure, your experience is that nobody is really very interested in your imagination for the future. And when it is It's maybe you get asked for some ideas and then they get ignored. And so our imagination is kind of ignored and humiliated and not respected. Something like the Civic Imagination Office and creating pacts starts to create a system where we invite people's imagination and respect it and honor it. And we start to see this drawing up of imagination through society. So that's what I wanted to share with you was the Imagination Sundial. And it's something I think that can work in organizations, in movements, in all kinds of different settings. And the most important thing is that the imagination is cultivating the imagination is going to be central to this. The next 10 years will be a kind of a battle of the imagination, a revolution of the imagination. And the transition movement, there are many transition groups across Belgium doing amazing work at the local scale. And the transition movement is really an invitation to people where they are, without waiting for permission, to start to create the kind of world we long for. You know, how do you give people a taste today in 2021 of the future that you maybe long for in 2030 or 2040? So in the transition movement, we say, you don't need anyone's permission. You don't need any funding. You just start with the people that you have in the neighborhood where you live. It could even just be on your street, in your apartment block. It could be in your neighborhood, in your district. It could be in your university. You could start small projects like small gardens or planting some trees. You could start more ambitious projects like a community energy project, like the kind of food projects that we see happening in and around Liège. What's important is that you give people a taste now. And I remember asking some people who started an amazing transition project in London, why do you do this? And they said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. So these projects are so important because as well, they for the people who are involved, it gives us so much more confidence that a different future is possible. If we just campaign and lobby, we can despair very quickly. But actually doing things and changing the world around you, even in a small amount, can be really, really helpful. So I hope this has been useful. I hope my English hasn't been too fast or too strange. If you would like to find out more about what I do, then robhopkins.net is my website. There's lots of things there. Transitionnetwork.org is where you can find out about the international transition movement. There are now transition groups in 50 countries around the world doing amazing things. And if you are interested in the podcast series that I do, From What If to What Next, there is a link there as well. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope this has been useful. And I really, really look forward to hearing your conversation, your questions and conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this presentation. It was very interesting to hear about it. It gave us a lot of hope. What's the matter? Okay. Yannick? No? Okay. So let's begin with the questions. What place would you give to transport in the future?
What place would I give to transport? Well, transport is really, really important because there's so much of our carbon is associated with the decisions that we make about transport. There is an exercise that I do at events where I invite people to imagine that they travel to the future, where they travel to 2030. That's not a utopia, but it is the result of us doing everything we could do during these 9 years. And I ask people to just take a walk in that world, in their imagination. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? And one of the things that people always say is there's so many less cars. There's no cars, and the air smells really amazing, and I can hear the bird song. And I feel like by 2030, we really need to have reached the stage where we have really reimagined transport. So this idea that somehow the future will be one where we've just replaced all the cars we have today with electric cars, that's not really that much of an improvement. You know, for me, this is not about alternative cars, but about alternatives to cars. So you can live in a city or around a city with no need for a car. You can cycle, you can use the bus, you can use different ways of traveling. And that's where we need to get to, I think. So that transport is much more democratic, transport is much easier, public transport is free, so that you would be crazy to have a car. Why would you want to have a car if you lived in the city? That feels to me like where we need to get to.
Nice, thank you. So I get a question from Kiara. She's asking, do Rob think that because of the COVID crisis, we are going to put our engagement for the local food, local agriculture, etc. away, or is it just the opposite?
I think that COVID has been really, really interesting. I mean, obviously, COVID has been awful in so many ways. And I don't for a moment want to, you know, make it sound trivial. But I think it has been really interesting in that many things that before COVID we were told were impossible, we now know are not impossible. So, for example, we could, if we said before, this is a climate emergency, we need to get businesses to completely change what they make. Like before the Second World War, you know, a company that made cars would start making airplanes, and they would do that within a year, maybe a year and a half. And when we would say, so we need to see big companies who make things that destroy the climate start to make things that are good for the climate, we would be told that's very naive, that's ridiculous, that's never going to happen. We saw companies who make who are engineers for Formula One car racing starting to make ventilators instead, because we needed ventilators more than we needed Formula One cars. We saw companies who make beer change their process so they could make hand sanitizer instead in a very short period of time. When we need to change, we can change things very quickly. I stopped flying in 2006. I don't fly anymore. I don't think it's possible to be an activist for the climate and fly on airplanes. Those two things don't go together for me. So, and we have created a movement now in 50 countries without me flying all around the world supporting those. This idea that you can create viable businesses, viable organizations without airplane travel, I would have been told was completely naive and completely ridiculous. Actually, now we know you can run any organization with everybody working from home. It's all completely possible. So the idea that the future will be one with much less travel is something which is much more accepted. Do we need to have districts in our cities now that are full of offices? I don't think we do anymore, do we? Let's use that space for something else so people can actually afford to live. In many places, with the support that the government gave to people, we came very close to a universal basic income, which would have been the perfect strategy and the perfect solution. We saw the power of communities during this time and how important it was that they supported each other. So I think that actually we also had the first lockdown where people, maybe for the first time in their lives, were able to live in a city where there were very few cars and the air smelled nice and there were no airplanes in the sky. I think when we come to look back at this time from the future, we will say that this really profoundly changed our sense of what the future could be, changed our expectations. And maybe the most important thing that COVID taught us was that scientists can sit down with politicians and the scientists can say, this is an emergency. You need to act as if this is an emergency. And the government would say, okay, don't worry about the money. We'll find the money and we will change whatever needs to be changed. We were never able to do that with the climate emergency before. With COVID, we could do it. So now we know it's possible. So I think with the world that we emerge into after COVID is going to be one that is really, really changed. And also many people have said, we don't want to go back to how it was before, to normal, because normal didn't work. And so we need to look forward to a different future. We know that air pollution makes people more vulnerable to COVID. We know that parks and open spaces were essential to people's mental health during this crisis. So we need less cars, more open space, more strategies for mental health. I think COVID has really changed our thinking on those things.
Thank you. We've got plenty of questions. The next is from Adrian. What do you think is the most useful? Talking by lobbying or acting with civil disobedience?
Both. So we absolutely need the people who are able to work with governments and to try and convince those governments to change in a kind of in a reasonable way, I suppose. We absolutely need the civil disobedience. We need the people who can say, this is not acceptable, like Extinction Rebellion, like other movements like that, who will say, no, you can't do this anymore. Like the Sunrise Movement in America, 350.org, the movements at Standing Rock, all of these things where people say, no, this is not okay anymore. You cannot carry on doing this. And I will sit here, I will be arrested because this matters. We need that absolutely. And we need the people who are starting to build what comes next, who are building, like Ceinture Alimentaire, who are building the new food economy, building the new energy economy, building the new ways that we're going to house people, and again, not waiting for permission. We need all of those things at once, because what's central to that is, through all of those things, is that little incremental steps are not acceptable anymore. You know, this is a climate emergency, and in an emergency, you act with the kind of bold, decisive, big steps that we have seen during COVID, because this is about system change. The system that underpins all of this is profoundly broken and is wrong on so many levels. And so the idea that we just ask politicians to make little changes, that's not acceptable anymore. We have a tiny little window of possibility to stay below 1.5 degrees of climate change. We cannot do that with an economy that still wants to grow every year, with a very, very wealthy elites who are taking all the money out and taking it to different places. The system has to change, and systems only ever change because people make them change. So that requires civil disobedience, absolutely, but it also requires all the other things that I've talked about. Oh, and just to say one thing about that, actually, that is, I think that it's not like either you do civil disobedience, or you do work like transition, or you do work with politicians. You know, many people do all of those things, because when people do very confrontational civil disobedience, it's exhausting. It's emotionally very, very draining. I know from whenever my wife goes on the big Extinction Rebellion rebellions in London for maybe 2 weeks, it takes about 3 months to recover from those, because they're exhausted after those things. And so doing something like transition, working in your town, creating gardens and things is really useful to balance that. So, and many people, when I go to the big Extinction Rebellion events, many of the people I meet there are also involved in transition and are also involved in politics. So it's not one or the other. We need to put different hats on and take them off and do like this.
Yes, you were talking about degrowth. So we got a question from Damien. who is asking how to resolve distribution problems if we stop economical growth. With the current mindset, it will just create workless people. How to change the economy to distribute equally work and money?
Yeah, good question, Damien. Thank you. I think I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't have a degrowth economy that actually employs as many people. It's just a different. It's a different approach. You know, at the moment the economy grows, and we measure how much it grows every year, and we consider it to be more successful the bigger it gets. Which is kind of weird. I'm a parent. I have children. You know, if the only way that I measured my success as a parent was just how much larger my child was than the previous year, and I was only happy if they just grew and grew and grew and grew until they were enormous, that would be kind of a bit weird. Actually, as a parent, what I want is for my child to grow until they're maybe ideally just slightly shorter than me, and then to grow in different ways, so to become wiser and kinder and more skilled and things like that. We don't talk about our economy in the same way. We just want it to be bigger every year. So I wonder whether you know, we need to change what we measure. Could we say that we are going to measure well-being? We're going to measure happiness. We're going to measure the number of children playing in the streets of our cities. We're going to measure the number of girls who feel safe to cycle home on their own at night. We're going to measure the amount of food that we eat that was grown on the food belt around our city. You know, the distribution problems are not something to do with growth. We can still create an economy where we grow things and we distribute things and we employ people, but the overall economy doesn't necessarily need to be grown. We have to remember that most of the growth in our economy at the moment is extracted and taken away to the Cayman Islands, to places like this. We can design, you know, I've started 2 businesses in my town. They grow, but they're a different model. They will grow to a size which feels like a good size, and then they will grow in different ways. But we employ lots and lots of people. I feel like to have an economy that distributes work and money equally does not mean that there will be less work for people. But also maybe we need to imagine, if we had a universal basic income, maybe we need to reimagine our relationship with work as well. And we need to create more space for people not to just be working all the time.
And speaking of that, Jeremy is asking, wouldn't regulating every company and redistribution result in a form of ecological socialism?
Say the first part again.
Wouldn't regulating every company and redistribution result in a form of ecological socialism?
I don't think it's a sort of redistribution with every company. I think it's more that you want an economy where that's more fair, and that actually, if you are a company that is based in a place, that you have some responsibility to that place, and that we need. So at the moment, many companies make things, and the things that they do, the impacts that they have, they don't pay for those things. So they need wood. So they just buy the wood. They don't pay any extra for the cost of the deforestation or the pollution to the water or the pollution to the air. If we changed the rules of the economy, then actually I feel like that's a more exciting way to do business. Any of those of you who look into the idea of donut economics, Kate Raworth's model of donut economics, which defines the place where business needs to happen. So we can't just assume that we can keep destroying the environment in many different ways. And we also have to make sure that we give everybody a basic platform on which to live. And then that defines this area, that what she calls the donut, which is where we need to be creative. My experience of being involved with that is that businesses, when you create this, when you identify the space to operate in, are incredibly clever and incredibly smart, and actually design much better business models that are much more responsible. You know, for me, the idea that putting restrictions on business or creating a new context in which businesses need to operate is somehow means that it's ecological socialism. I mean, maybe you could call it ecological socialism. I would call it setting the framework that we all need in order to survive to the end of this century, and inviting businesses to play their role in it and to bring their ingenuity and their entrepreneurship to working within that context. And I meet many businesses that are stepping up to that challenge and are far, far more interesting than the ones who would just dismiss any kind of change to how business works as being sort of socialism or something terrible.
Yes. And now we got another question from Vincent in English, I think. Could Rob give us some recommendations regarding the successful and practical implementation of think globally, act locally concept?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, for me, I think the Ceinture Alimentaire project is a really beautiful example of that. I would say there are many places where there are communities who are motivated by the global climate emergency, who have started their own energy company for the city, a community-owned energy company. They invite people in that city to invest into a community energy company, and then they install renewables in that city. Is a beautiful example for me. There are many examples of people who are starting new food projects. I love going to Paris now and seeing the number of rooftop farms and rooftop gardens and the expansion of urban agriculture in Paris. One of the projects that I'm involved with where I live is where the community is becoming its own housing developer. Housing is something always done by commercial developers who just like to extract the money from the town, often in a way that's quite corrupt and ecologically destructive. So I see places now where the community are saying, we're going to build our own houses, and we're going to use local materials. We're going to build them in a way where we train people, where the money stays locally within this economy. So we can look at housing, food, energy, transport, and we can see many, many examples of think globally, act locally. And actually, I'm going to put a link into here where you can find, so when COP21 happened in Paris in 2015, Transition Network created a little book that was called 21 Stories of Transition. And there's a French version of that, and which I'm going to give you the link to the English version. And I think on the Transition France website, you can find the French one. I'm going to put a link in here in the chat, and you can find that. And that has lots of stories from around the transition movement, of stories of people doing change.
Okay, thank you. We will share it with pleasure. Another question from Louis. How to force people that have no interest in changing to change? Do we use democracy, force, rebellion, revolution? What do we do?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I feel like the first thing that I would say is that we the best place to start is with people who you don't have to spend hours and hours trying to convince. So there are already people that you know, and there are already people around where you live who understand the situation and who are ready to do things and who are looking for other people to collaborate with. So I would start with those people. And, you know, transition is a really good way to meet those people and to start working together. And it's a good model to use to start working together. So you don't need to wait to convince everybody, because that takes a lot of energy and it often doesn't work, as I'm sure many of you will have experienced. So, but I find the best way to try to convince people is with examples and with stories and things that they can see and experience. And I think that many people, they might say, oh, well, the idea that a community could make its own energy is just completely fanciful and ridiculous, and it can never happen. Well, if you can show them somewhere where that is actually happening, then maybe it kind of changes. If you have a project like Ceinture Alimentaire happening in Liège, it makes it much harder for people to say, well, it's completely naive to imagine you could ever reimagine food in a city. Well, you could do it like this. So I feel like in terms of individuals, we work with the stories and we work with people as they are. The thing that was interesting about Ceinture Alimentaire when I met the mayor was that initially I think the municipality thought they were all a bit crazy. But then as time went on, they started to see this thing was working. And then they said, how can we help? What are the blockages? How can we remove the blockages? On a national scale as well, I think there is a role for saying, how can we help? What can we do? This is already happening. We're not waiting for your permission. We're already starting projects. But then also there is a role, as we've said, for disobedience and for different models of activism, because this is an emergency and we have to act as if this is an emergency. So, and also many times we live in places where governments will make policy or will make funding that communities can apply for without thinking that this is going to be used in a way that's really radical, but we can take those things and use them in a way that's really radical. Often they talk the language about climate change, maybe without really understanding what needs to happen, but we can take that and we can turn it and use it in a way to make really radical projects. So I think it's all of those things.
Nice, thank you. I will choose my targets better now. I got a quite interesting question from Audrey. Would you marry me?
I'm already married, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, that's not a problem, I think. So, only joking. The next question from me. Do you think that we should have fewer children and adopt more?
Well, I'm not a very good person to answer that question because I have 4 children. Okay. So I don't feel I have any moral high ground from which to answer that question. I do think that we should have less children, and I feel like if I was starting again, I would not have had so many children. But I do think as well we will need compassionate, wise people in the future who are able to do work in that future. But clearly, if we are serious about climate change and the need to really act on that, we need to, I would say, stop flying or fly a lot less. We need to stop eating meat or eat a lot less meat. We need to make serious decisions about how we travel, and we need to have serious conversations about how we have whether we have children or not. And there is a big movement now of young people saying they're not going to have children anymore because of the climate emergency, which I find really, really sad that we have got to the stage where that is a really kind of serious conversation that people need to have. Would I have children now if I was starting again? I probably would, but not so many. Yeah, don't know. It's a very, very personal. It's a very personal decision and a very, very personal question for people, I think. Now.
Sure. Next question: is capitalism compatible with our future regarding all the problems you detailed during the presentation?
I think it depends what we mean by capitalism. Certainly capitalism as it's practiced in Europe and in large parts of the world in 2021 is absolutely not compatible with it, no, because it's based on growth, it's based on extraction of resources, it sees people as being less important than capital. It's this idea that capital always has to find a place to grow, always has to find a place to expand. But the idea that the idea of capitalism as a model where people can run a business which can make profit and people can invest their money in different things, I don't have a problem with. I think there are models of capitalism that would be an awful lot better than the current one, but this sort of neoliberal growth-based economics is absolutely incompatible with the future, because it's what's caused it. It's the idea that you would trust. So we have had capitalism for however long we've had capitalism for a long time, and when you look back over the last 150 years, when the worst of the climate emergency has happened, when most of the carbon emissions in the world. So I'm 52. So during my lifetime, about 70% of all the carbon emissions in history have been created during my lifetime. If you're 30, more than 50% of all the carbon emissions were created during your lifetime. So it's really during the last sort of 60, 70 years that the vast majority of carbon was produced. During the time of a capitalist system, which has become more and more neoliberal, more and more free market, and during that time the emissions have gone higher and higher and higher. So when you're thinking about what's the model we're going to trust to get us out of this problem, you're not going to trust that system anymore, because it's clearly a complete disaster and a complete failure. And so it has to be really reimagined. Could we imagine a kind of a more localized, a more resilient, a kind of a transition version of capitalism? Yeah, maybe, but I think maybe we would call it something else, because I would say maybe capitalism has a bit too much baggage at this stage. It wouldn't be called communism. It wouldn't be called, I don't know what you'd call it. I think you'd call it transition for me. It would be an economy that would be in service to nature and to human beings' capacity to thrive, and its intention would be to create the best possible conditions for human culture and human society to thrive and to prosper, but with a different definition of success, which is about well-being and a different way of understanding prosperity. That prosperity is really about nurturing people and communities and about contentment. So but certainly capitalism as we have it today, no, that's like I don't know, leaving a psychopath to babysit your children. It's just really not the right thing to carry us forward.
Yes, I don't know if you know Émeric Caron. It's a French journalist, and he invented the concept of biodemocracy.
No, I haven't heard that.
No.
No.
I thought it was a good name to.
Sounds a good name. Yeah, I like it.
Mm-hmm. Biodemocracy.
Like
Another question from the Jolly Joker. Do you think that we will have a civil war because of climate change and people getting forced to leave their homes because of not enough food placed for all people?
Well, I hope not. I think there are two directions that we can take. If we carry on with business as usual, then we know what will happen. We will pass 2 degrees, we will pass 3 degrees. At 2 degrees, large parts of the world start to become uninhabitable, as is already happening at, where are we now, 1.2 degrees increase in the temperature. We are already seeing parts of the world that are becoming uninhabitable. Parts of Iran, parts of Syria, parts of Africa, where it's in Pakistan, it's just becoming impossible to live. You cannot live when it's 50 degrees. It's just impossible. So we are already seeing people who need to move, and we are already seeing the borders in Europe closing down, and this terrible kind of erecting of walls between countries, which I think is entirely aware of what is coming in terms of the climate and ecological emergency and the number of people who will be needing to move. And so, yeah, if we don't do anything and we carry on with business as usual, there are many nightmare scenarios that we can imagine: civil wars, famines, starvation, large parts of the world becoming uninhabitable. I like to try and focus on what could be possible if we did do everything we possibly could do, and I think it is still possible if we can mobilize people with enough creativity and purpose and so on, that we can absolutely avoid that and do far better than that. You know, we now it's very easy, I think, to focus on all the things that are going wrong, and there are many things that are going wrong. You know, but at the same time, Scotland last year generated 97% of its electricity from renewable energy. You know, we are seeing the fossil fuel industry is dying. Coal is dying. The amount of governments the amount of governments now who are finally actively withdrawing their support from the fossil fuel industry is really inspirational. The amount of public awareness around these issues is growing very quickly. And now that we have you know, Joe Biden and COP26 coming up, it's not enough. But imagine what we would be feeling like having this conversation if Donald Trump had just been elected for another 4 years. You know, that there are many reasons to feel like we might be moving towards a world with civil wars, but there's also lots and lots of reasons, I think, to think that we're moving towards a world where things are going to start changing really rapidly for the better.
So you made us imagining something, and Adrian would like to make you an imagination exercise. If you imagine you are elected as a government representative, what would be the first strategy, law, incentive, or other thing you would create, implement? Hard question.
Well, I think the first thing that I would do would be to be honest with everybody about the fact that this is a climate emergency and that we need to act as if this is a climate emergency. So I would declare a climate and ecological emergency and say that is going to be the thing that we're going to work through. I think I would I think maybe the first place to start is with I would invite every organization which is funded with government funding to identify how it intends to maximize the imagination of everybody who works for it and everybody who works with it. So what would our health system, our education system look like if its ideal was to create the best conditions for the imagination? So not to create conditions of stress and overwhelm and pressure, but to create space in people's lives. I think our education system would then transform hugely. It would move away from testing. It would move towards more play, more problem solving. We would redesign schools. Our health system would work in a very different way. So for me, having like a national imagination act would maybe be the first thing that I would do.
It makes me want to be part of it.
Good, yeah, I'd like that too.
Another question from Antoine. For us Europeans, it's quite easy to say that it's time to change, to slow down, because we already live in so much comfort. What about countries that are still under development?
So yes, that's a good question, Antoine. And I think that so first thing I would say to that is I feel like we really need to challenge this idea of development, because development so often happens on the terms of the global north, the wealthy nations, and it's kind of very often a new form of colonialism, which is designed so as to serve the needs of the wealthier countries. And I'm really inspired by movements like Via Campesina and the Zapatistas and Buen Vivir and movements like this, which are about alternatives to development. It's like, no. We get to define what we mean by development. It doesn't mean getting into massive debt with the World Bank. It doesn't mean opening all our resources to multinational companies to exploit. It doesn't mean the sort of model that we see happening around the world. But at the same time, I feel like, yes, of course, there needs to be an improvement in living standards in many parts of the world. And I've always been inspired by something called contraction and convergence, which is a model that was created by an economist called Aubrey Mayer, who said basically where I do this up here. So the global north is up here, the global south is down here, and with the place that we need to get to, the sustainable point, is this line here. So the global north needs to find a skillful way to come down to here, and the global south needs to find a skillful way to come up to here. And the role of the global north is to support the global south to do that work. But for me, I always felt like the biggest challenge with that is, how do we convince the people who are currently here that they need to find a way down to here? Because that will only happen if this place looks more exciting than this place. If it feels like this place is completely beautiful and perfect and non-negotiable, and that somehow we have to leave and go down here and it feels like we're going backwards, then it will never happen. So we really designed transition as something that would support the people who are here to find a way down to here. And then to support the people who are coming up to meet them from the global south, so we can reach a place that's fair. So that means that in the global north, we need to be building resilience, building economic justice, creating relationships with the global south, which are about building resilience in that place and increasing land access and social justice there, while doing the same here. I feel like the struggle for land rights, the struggle for equality, the struggle for economic fairness is happening in both places. So when a city like Liège is building a model like Ceinture Alimentaire, it's not doing it so that the city can turn its back on the global south and say, we don't care. It's doing that as an act of solidarity with organizations in the global south who are doing the same thing and trying to build new relationships to land and new economics in those places too.
Yeah. Question from Mr. Lulu. Regarding the growing of China and its new colonizing movement of world's natural resources, how will we do to face it, and how should we react as European, as countries?
China is really difficult because it is massively resource heavy and is buying up land and resources around the world, in Africa and many different places. But still, we have to bear in mind that the footprint of the average person in China is much lower than the average person in the UK or in Belgium. And actually, the Chinese government are doing some really interesting things around, are being very ambitious around climate change. But then, I'm somebody who has been very involved for a long time in supporting the movement for a free Tibet and supporting the Tibetan community in exile. And the experience of Tibet, the experience of the Uyghur Muslims, the experience of many minorities in China, well, and of everybody really, in a totalitarian state is really, really frightening. And I feel, I don't know, I always feel like a lot of the way that I respond to things like this is that we need to work with China, because China's ambition is going to make the chances of a really binding agreement at the climate talks in November this year really important. And China can work at a scale of ambition that not many other countries can. But at the same time, we need to, again, be building the economies of the places where we live so that we're not so dependent on China. Part of the problem is that, like Russia and China, have lent so much money to Europe and to the US that it's very, very hard for any of those places to kind of resist them anymore, or to not work with them. But yeah, it's very complicated. But for me, the thing is that we need to be designing economies of food and energy and other things here where we, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there was a decision where we said, we're not going to make anything in Europe anymore. We're going to make it all in China because it's cheaper. And I feel like it's really important to start bringing some of that manufacturing back to Europe and start to create more jobs here so that we are less dependent. And that's going to be really useful politically as well, I think. But it's complicated.
Sure. Again, Chiara. Her question is: I'm in my second year in social assistant license. I don't know the name in English, but maybe it's social worker.
Okay.
What do you think? What could we do socially regarding your thoughts as a social worker?
I feel like we need people in every occupation, whether it's being a teacher or a social worker or a chef or a lawyer or an engineer. We need people who understand this stuff. And we need people who are advocating for it within those organizations. And, social work is an area where it can be very easy to see everything in separate silos. I don't know if the word silo works in French, but, this idea of different bubbles. So we say, okay, so physical health is here, and mental health is here, and housing is here, and environment is here, and we see them all as different. So we need a mental health strategy over here, and we need a food strategy over here. What I would love to see is people who go into areas like social work thinking, how do we connect all of these things together? So who can say, hang on, we need to be looking at housing strategy as being a mental health strategy. We need to look at how we feed people as being connected to physical health, mental health. And I think after COVID, it's much easier to make those arguments now because people can see those connections. Maybe we need to say, we're going to design a housing strategy for this city as a mental health strategy, as an employment strategy, as an imagination strategy. I would really like to see people who are social workers, who think in systems, who think holistically, who think in terms of connections, who don't just see one thing as being, so somebody over here, this family over here are having a big breakdown and there's mental health problems within this family. Okay, so what's the context? Because actually, I think in many ways, depression and overwhelm and despair and an inability to cope is actually probably the most reasonable response to how the world is in 2021, because it's completely mad and everything's falling to bits and we have a climate emergency and so many people are just carrying on as if nothing's wrong. Of course, if you are experiencing problems like that, it's really because you're paying attention. So rather than just saying, okay, so we need to give them some support for, I don't know, give them some medication or something. Actually, they're the indicators that we have a problem. So how do we support that and recognize that that is happening because of a much bigger, complex picture? And how do we change that picture to really support people?
Nice. So time flies. It's about 7:40. So it's the last question.
Okay.
Last question is, how could we make the medical system more sober concerning treatments, medicines, technology?
How can we make it more? Yeah. I guess we need to. I mean, it's not really my field, but I know that. I guess we need a healthcare system which, as I was saying for the last question, thinks more holistically. You know, when we live in a time where people spend less and less time in nature and more time with screens, more and more time away from other people, where many people have less and less access to good food or really know how to cook, where people have work lives which are really stressful and create a lot of anxiety, then it's really no surprise that people are ill. You know, so it's not just having a medical system that treats the symptoms. We need to have something that recognizes the cause. And I've really loved seeing over the last couple of years how, for example, the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, which are the two main medical academic journals in the UK, have become really outspoken about climate change and really even supportive of movements like transition, of the need for a national food policy. You know, I would like to, and I've loved to see during Extinction Rebellion how there is something called Doctors Declare Emergency, which is a movement of people who work as doctors and work in healthcare who are coming out and being arrested and blocking streets because they're saying, how can you're asking us to take care of people in a world where you're not taking care of the world. So for me, a healthcare system needs to be massively around health rather than just curing disease, and needs to be a lot more radical and joined up in terms of how it thinks about the future and what we do about
it. I will let Louis take place for the conclusion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oops, I'm here. Thank you very much, Rob. It was a pleasure to receive you. Yes, thank you very much to take the time and answer all our questions. We were a bit off topic sometimes, but it was some questions were dear to us, though, so we took the time to ask them to you and to see what your answer were. This was the last conference, the last speaking event from our association, I would say. So I would have wished to thank all of them, and especially Cécile, who is backstage dealing with all the techniques. She has been very proactive with us and very efficient and always here to help us. So thank you very much to her. And to everybody who is watching, thank you very much for watching all our conference. Thank you to my roommates who are always behind the scenes but working hard. So either watching or collecting questions. Yes, it was 2 years of hard work for us, and it is we are celebrating the end with you. So thanks a lot. It's the achievement of our trip and our project. So it's very rewarding. And yes, I don't know what to say except thank you a million times. It was a pleasure. Everybody, glad to see you and listen to that inspiring talk. Yes, yes, thank you to you, Rob. Very, I don't know. I have nothing to say left. It was.
Well, I'll just say thank you all so much for coming, and I really hope to actually see you all and do this in person very soon, because then afterwards we could go for some very delicious Belgian beers.
Yeah,
we'll do that next time.
Yes, we can maybe send you one, because here we are gonna celebrate our last talk. So we have a. Ready for us to be opened up. So yes, it was a pleasure. Maybe we can thank you everyone for watching, and see you next year. Rob, it was a pleasure, and we will surely come and see you if you come here in Belgium, and welcome you in our home.
Okay.
See you.
Bye bye.
See you everyone.
À bientôt.
À bientôt tout le monde. Merci beaucoup.